I always start my presentations with the empty tomb. And I always like to say that when I was a little girl, I thought the stone was rolled away so that Jesus could get out. But now, as I've learned more about the King of the universe, the creator of the universe, that stone is not rolled away for Jesus to get out. It's rolled away so we can look in. And so that is what they duplicated in the exhibit, is the stone is rolled away so that we can go in and we can see what was left in the tomb. It really wasn't an empty tomb, because the Gospel of John is very clear that the Apostle Peter and the Apostle John ran to the tomb on the morning of Easter, and when they went in, they saw the linen cloth lying there. And Father Dalton talked about this, that the verb that is used for how the fabric was there was, it's an idea of almost like a balloon that's been deflated. So it did have volume, and then now it's deflated. So it's empty and lying there, but it implies that there was something inside of it before, the verb that was used in the scriptures themselves. The other thing that the scriptures talk about in the Gospel of John is that the face cloth was folded up and it was lying separate. And you may get questions about that. We covered that. Come on in, Brandon. We covered that last time when we talked about the Sudarium of Oviedo. So I'm not going to go over that again today at this point, but the face cloth that was wrapped up and separate is the Sudarium, which is in Oviedo, Spain. We covered that Peter and John ran to the tomb, went in, and I think it's really important that John is very specific in his gospel. He says he saw and he believed. And so it wasn't until he saw that empty tomb with the grave clothes in it that he understood everything that Jesus had taught. So I just want to talk about this for a minute. In the first century in Jewish burials, the typical process would be to wash the body, clip the hair, cut the fingernails, and the body may have been naked, but then wrapped in this clean linen and put on the shelf, which is also known as a sepulcher. And so before the first century, in the Jewish tradition, that body would have been left there for a year, and then at the end of the year, they would come in, the family would come in, and the body would be decayed, so all that would be left would be the bones. And you know, in the Old Testament it says that he was gathered home with his family, like that when it talks about Abraham, that he was buried and he was gathered together with his fathers. So the tradition before first century was that all the bones of the family were just scooped together. So it was like an ever-increasing pile of bones. So the whole family's bones were gathered together. Like it's sort of this beautiful imagery of the whole family being joined together. But in the first century, they started to be influenced by the Greek culture and the Roman culture. And the Romans, they put their bones into the ossuary jars. And so the first century Jews in Jerusalem started adopting this custom. Now out in the countryside where people weren't so Romanized, they still just let the bones decay and then swept them all together. But in Jerusalem in the first century, they started collecting the bones and putting them in ossuary jars. I just thought that was so interesting, so I thought I would share it with you. So in the tomb that Jesus was placed in, the scriptures tell us that it was the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. He was a rich man, and no one had ever been placed in that tomb before. And so you can imagine that they went into the tomb, they had the body of Jesus, but as was pointed out when we were in the exhibit, his body was not washed. And there were several reasons for this. One is because it was almost the sundown, so it was the Sabbath. Are there more?
That's it.
That's it, okay.
If she finds more, she'll get it.
Okay, I might know where there's some more. So,
oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you didn't get a book, I might be able to find some more. Thank you, Frank. So Jesus' body was not washed because they were in haste. They needed to get him sealed into the tomb before sunset because it was the Passover. But the real reason is because the Jews believed that any blood that was shed post-mortem, so after death, that blood needed to be kept with the body. And so that's the reason why that face cloth was put on Jesus' face when he was still on the cross, dead, but on the cross, So they put the face cloth over his face to collect the blood and the pleural fluid that was coming out of his nose and his ears, and also to protect that visually his family from seeing that, his mother and the people at the foot of the cross. So that cloth, that burial cloth, was kept with him. So that was put over his face while he was still on the cross. Then he was moved to the place where the body was laid out and covered with the linen, but that face cloth was removed and folded up and then kept with the body, but it was not over his face at the time of the burial. So that's the real reason why his body wasn't washed, because that blood, his body was still oozing, especially that side wound, was still oozing when he was taken down from the cross. And so that blood needed to be kept with the body because it's post-mortem blood. And so that ties this burial to the Jewish burials in this funeral museum context. I like to explain some of the theological significance of Jesus as the perfect sacrifice. And so in order to do that, I back up and go back to what is the Feast of the Passover? Why were all of these people coming to Jerusalem in the first place? Because there are a lot of people that don't have the dots connected, like they've heard of Moses and they've heard of Abraham, but they don't really know what the relationship is and how that connects to Jesus. So I like to back up to this is a pilgrimage feast. So the Jewish people would come into Jerusalem up to 3 times a year for these great pilgrimage feasts. And so the Feast of Passover was one of those, and any able-bodied male who could would travel into Jerusalem to offer sacrifices at the temple. And so I have this slide in there because you can see all those little people. It's estimated that between 100 and 200,000 pilgrims came to Jerusalem every year for the Feast of the Passover. And so Passover reflects when the Jews were in prison in Egypt, and they were released after Moses went to Pharaoh. You know the story, 10 times. Moses went to Pharaoh, let my people go, and Pharaoh said no. So there were the various plagues, the boils and the locusts and the frogs and the blood, the Nile River turning into blood. So all of these things happened. So the 9th plague was a darkness came over the entire land of Egypt. And the Bible says it was a darkness so deep you could feel it. So that was the 9th plague. And I believe it lasted for 3 days. I need to double check that. The 10th plague was that the firstborn of every family in Egypt, whether they were Jewish or Egyptian, the firstborn would be killed by the angel of death. And the only protection was to sacrifice the perfect lamb. And the blood of that perfect lamb would be put on the doorposts of the home. So this blood would be dipped into the blood of the lamb and then marked on the doorposts of the Jewish home. And then the angel of death would see the blood and know to pass over that home. And so that's where Passover began. And so it had to be an unblemished lamb and a perfect lamb. None of his bones could be broken. And the other thing I think is very interesting is that the lamb had to be cooked and it had to be completely eaten, all of it eaten that night by the people before they left on the Exodus. So this is what they're celebrating, the Jewish people. They're coming into Jerusalem, they're offering sacrifices, they're sin sacrifices. So they're making atonement for the sins of themselves and of their family by coming into the temple, bringing their perfect sacrifice and offering it at the temple. And you can almost hear John the Baptist when you look at this. When the first thing John the Baptist says to Jesus is, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And so that is tying Jesus all the way back to this perfect sacrificial lamb. So Jesus was a good Jew. So he had come into Jerusalem with his friends to celebrate the Feast of the Passover. And the scriptures tell us that he had his meal with his friends and instituted the Eucharist. But he got up kind of abruptly in the middle of the meal and went across the Kidron Valley, and then went up to the Mount of Olives, and he took his friends with him there, and he asked them to pray, and he went into the garden and he started praying in earnest. And the scriptures say that he asked, "May this cup pass from me." And Father Dalton actually gives a great lecture on the meaning of this whole idea of the cup. And one of the images of that cup is when the Israelites were in the desert and they had sinned while Moses was up on the mountain getting the law. They had created this golden calf, and they were worshiping this golden calf. Well, when Moses came down and he was so angry with them, he had them grind up that gold, and they put it in a drink, and they all had to drink it. They had to drink the results of their sin. And so, when you know that when that's part of this cup that Jesus is saying, could it pass from me? This drinking the sin, taking all of the sin upon himself as he's entering into his passion. And so that he's praying earnestly, and the Gospel of Luke tells us that he had this condition of hematidrosis. And this is a true physical condition where when somebody who's under a lot of emotional stress, the capillaries in their veins expand, and blood starts to seep out of their blood vessels and then comes through the pores of their skin. And so it looks like they're actually sweating blood. And this is a condition called hematidrosis. It's documented. It can occur in people. And one of the side effects of hematidrosis is that the skin, which is the largest organ in your body, becomes extremely sensitive to touch, so that any touch would be painful. And so the next thing that happens is that we see Judas coming into the garden, and he comes up to Jesus and he gives him a kiss. And so even this kiss from Judas would have been painful because of the pressure on his skin. So the agony, the passion of Jesus really begins right there in the garden, Garden of Gethsemane. So the Jewish guards come, and it's the Jewish guards who come and take Jesus away. And they take him away in chains out of the garden and take him up to the home of the high priest for the beginning of these trials. And I just want to point out that these are the Jewish guards. So Jesus had been preaching in the temple. These Jewish guards had seen him in the temple all of this time. They knew who he was. They knew what his message was. And yet they came for him in the dark with weapons to take him away in chains. So that's where we really begin this passion of Jesus.
One thing.
Yes.
When one of them cut the ear off a guard,
Mm-hmm.
I would have thought they would have, when Jesus put it back on the guy, they would have, wait a minute, folks.
Yeah. And the scriptures tell us that the guards fell back in awe and amazement, and yet they still continued on with what they had come to do.
And also the sensitivity to the skin, do they know approximately how long it lasts? Would he have still been pretty sensitive when they took him away?
This would have been something that would have kept up throughout the whole passion. So it's just the degree of suffering that he took on himself began really at that
I think that's very
time.
important.
Yeah. I just have been doing a Bible study, and it's on Lamentations, which you don't normally want to read Lamentations, but it talks about all the destruction of Jerusalem before the captivity in 560 BC. But it talks about how the whole city of Jerusalem was destroyed and all the terrible things, the calamities that befell Jerusalem. And I just kept thinking to myself, in the Shroud, it shows us that Jesus took all that suffering in his body. And it all points to Jesus, that he was taking this on for our sake so that we didn't have to. Okay, so I'm going to give you kind of a flyby of what happened to Jesus, kind of picking from all the Gospels, because they're all give the same story, but from different perspectives. And so each one of the Gospels tells about Jesus in a different way. So, for example, in Mark, we see Jesus as the suffering servant. We see him as the Son of Man. In John, we see him as the king. his kingdom is already established. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. So we're getting pictures of Jesus in different ways. So the different gospel writers emphasize different things. So I'm going to put together for you what the gospels tell us about the passion. So the first thing is that they take Jesus before Ananias. And Ananias was the father-in-law of the current high priest. And his whole family, Ananias' family, was a whole family of high priests. So his sons, Ananias had been the high priest, and then his sons had been the high priest, and then Caiaphas was his son-in-law. So for that year, Caiaphas was the high priest. But one of the Gospels tells us that the first thing they did was they took Jesus before Ananias. So here's this patriarch of this supposedly holy family of priests, and yet he wanted Jesus to be condemned to death, and he said, take him before Caiaphas. And so that's when the trials sort of begin, as Jesus goes to the home of Caiaphas. He's taken there by these Jewish guards and under arrest and in chains, and he goes into the courtyard of the high priest. And it's so interesting in the Gospels, we see that John may have been related to that family, because the scriptures tell us that he was known by the guard at the door, so they let John go in. So John's Gospel is an eyewitness account of what happened there. And meanwhile, Peter is in the courtyard. And that's where we get Peter denying Jesus 3 times. We have 3 different people ask him, weren't you with him? Weren't you one of those? I recognize your accent. And Jesus, no, I wasn't. But at that same time that's happening, Jesus is in front of Caiaphas. And they're trying to find witnesses to bring a case against Jesus. And in the Jewish law, you have to have 2 witnesses that agree with each other. And of course, the women's witness isn't taken into account. So it has to be 2 male witnesses. And they keep getting these different witnesses with conflicting statements. And the witnesses, they can never agree upon the charge against Jesus. And so finally, Caiaphas turns to Jesus and says, well, you tell me, is it true what they say? Are you really the Son of Man? And Jesus says, I want to tell you exactly what he says. He says, Caiaphas asked Jesus, are you the Messiah? And Jesus answered, you have said so. But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. So that is a quote from the book of Daniel. So Jesus was saying of himself that he is the Son of Man, which means that he is God's Son and the Messiah. So when he said those words, everybody there knew who he was claiming to be. He said, I am, and then you will see me as the Son of Man in the future. And so the high priest tore his garments, which was against the law. It was against the law for the high priest to tear his garments. So he is acting in opposition to what he's supposed to do. Tore his garments, and he said, you're a blasphemer. You're proclaiming to be God's Son. So blasphemy is worthy of being put to death. And so
Tore his garments, the priest garment or Jesus?
No, the high priest tore his own garments,
okay.
Which is a sign of mourning. To tear your garments, and it was something that people did in a time of mourning, but it was prohibited for the high priest to tear his garments. So Caiaphas is already showing his disregard for the law that he's supposed to be upholding. So,
and do we know, was Caiaphas a Levite?
yes, because he would have been, because he was a priestly line. So the Levites were the priestly line.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I said, they're trying to find these 2 witnesses to agree, and they never do. So Jesus basically condemns himself. And so the penalty for blasphemy is stoning, because in the Jewish law, the greatest punishment would be being stoned to death. And also, the Jewish people did not have the authority to put someone to death because they were under the governorship of the Romans. So in order for Jesus to have to be put to death, they had to take him to Pontius Pilate for the proclamation of crucifixion. So before they did that, the the Jewish soldiers mocked Jesus. And the scriptures tell us that they began to spit at him, they blindfolded him, they struck him with their fists and said, "Prophesy." And the guards took him and beat him. So that's in the Gospel of Mark. So this is what is reflected in the face of the man of the shroud. And I just want to point out that they're saying, "Prophesy, prophesy." And his prophecy is being fulfilled at that very moment in the courtyard when Peter is denying him 3 times, because he had just prophesied that. And there's so many ironies in this passion as you look at these things going on side by side. So in the face of the man of the shroud, we can see that he has been brutally beaten. And so he has a broken nose, a deviated septum. His right cheek is broken, or not broken, but swollen. And the scientists have been able to determine that he was hit in the face with a rod that was 1.5 inches in diameter. I mean, that is how much information is available on the shroud to tell in that level of detail. And through the rest of this talk, I'm going to be using this sculpture. This is by a Spanish artist, and that's kind of what Genevieve was referring to. Like, some of the sculptures are very gruesome, but this really shows you the level of brutality that was put against Jesus. But I want to tell you a story that I heard from Rudy. He said, I've asked him about this since too, because I wanted to confirm, like, you really said this, right? So when I heard him when I was a teenager, I remember him saying that one of the things that convicted him about the shroud image is that the face of the nose of the man is clearly broken. And so he was looking at it saying, well, none of his bones could be broken. So how can this be the face of Jesus? And then he said he realized that the nose is cartilage. And so truly none of his bones were broken. And that was the point for Rudy when he recognized that this Shroud of Turin was truly authentic. So this is the Jewish guards are mocking Jesus. There, as I read to you, they struck him with their fists, they spit at him, and one of the Gospels says that they plucked out his beard. And that is a fulfillment of prophecy where it says in Isaiah 50, "I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out the beard." And often in art, you'll see Jesus with this kind of forked beard, and it's because you can see on the shroud that that is an area where the hair has been plucked out, and that was torture. That was a part of the mocking and the torture that was a part of his passion. So the next thing that happens is the Jewish guards do all of these things to Jesus, and then they take him over to Pilate because they want to have this sentence of death to be fulfilled. So they take Jesus to the praetorium, and the scriptures are very specific that they stay outside because these Jewish leaders who are falsely condemning a man to death don't want to be impure because they want to be able to celebrate the Passover. So they stay outside, and so Pilate comes out to them, and Pilate says, "What concern of this to me? Why would I be concerned about this? I don't care if this man says he's your God. I don't care." And so the Jewish authorities say, "Well, you should care because he's saying that he's a king, and so he's a threat to Caesar. And so that is punishable by death. That is being an insurrectionist." And so they tell Pilate that Jesus needs to be turned over for crucifixion because of his being an insurrectionist. But Pilate, he tries every which way to let Jesus go. He has various techniques that he's going to utilize to try to set him free. One of them, the first one, is he knows that Herod is in town. Now, you've all heard of Herod. So there was Herod the Great, and he was the one who made the first century temple, the one that had the picture of this great architectural masterpiece. And Herod the Great had 3 sons, and one of these sons, Herod Antipas, was in charge of the area of Galilee where Jesus was from. And so, like a good Jew, Herod had come into Jerusalem to sacrifice for the Passover. But Herod was not really a good Jew. He was kind of just Jewish in name only. But he had the hereditary title, King of the Jews. Herod did. And so Pilate knew that Herod was in town to celebrate the Passover. And so he said, well, I'm going to make this Herod's problem. So he sends Jesus over to be in front of Herod. And Herod had heard of Jesus. He knew who he was. And the Bible tells us that he wanted him to perform some miracles for him. So he wanted Jesus to come and be like a magician and do something for him. And the scriptures tell us that he didn't say anything. He stood there completely silent in front of Herod. And this is in fulfillment of Isaiah 53. He stands there silent like a lamb, or like a sheep before the shearers. He is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. And so Herod got frustrated with Jesus, sent him back before Pilate. And the scriptures tell us that Pilate and Herod became friends that day. And here's another one of those ironies, because they were looking for two witnesses to condemn Jesus, but what they have are two witnesses who declared that he's innocent. So that's pretty fascinating. So the next thing we see in the scriptures is that Pilate tries again. He wants to find another way to release Jesus. So he tells the people on the feast of the Passover, I always release a prisoner for you. So how about we release this guy Jesus and move on? And of course the crowd says, no, we want Barabbas. Release Barabbas. So Barabbas was a known insurrectionist, and he was a known murderer. And the other thing that's interesting about Barabbas is his name is Bar Abba. And Bar means son of, and Abba means God. So Barabbas' name meant son of God. So here we have this phony son of God, Barabbas, being offered, and we have the true son of God, Jesus, being offered. And the people choose Barabbas. So the next thing that Pilate tries is to have Jesus scourged. So this is where we get to our exhibit. So I gave you a lot of background here, but most people think of the Passion really beginning with the scourging, but as you've seen, it really started before that in the garden. So Pilate has this idea to have Jesus scourged. So scourging could be used in three ways. One way was to have somebody be scourged as a precursor to crucifixion. So the Roman soldiers who did the scourging had to be very expert in what they did, because they couldn't scourge somebody so badly that they wouldn't make it to the cross. So if they were being scourged as a precursor to crucifixion, it would be a little bit of a gentler scourging, if that's possible. Then the second would be to be scourged as just a punishment in and of itself. And then the third option would be to be scourged to death, because scourging was so brutal that it could easily result in the victim's death. So historians think that Pilate was trying to have Jesus freed as a result of the scourging. So he opted for option 2, to have Jesus scourged brutally. And then Jesus was brought out before the people, and Pilate said, here's the man. He's no threat. Look at this man. He's completely debilitated. Let's just release him now and go home. But the people said, no, crucify him. So in the exhibit, there were 2 flagrants. There's one that looks like this, which is what historians think was used to crucify Jesus. And then there's another one that was in there, which I've never seen that kind before. So this is the one we're going to talk about. There are scourge marks located all over the body, throughout the entire shroud image are the scourge marks. And as it says here on this slide, which I will send to all of you, there's 365 wounds associated with the scourging. And it's because that flagrum has the wooden handle, like you saw in the exhibit, about 18 inches long, and then the 3 leather thongs that come off of that. And then at the end of each of those leather thongs is kind of a barbell-shaped piece of metal. And often those barbells had at the end of them like hooks, so that when the metal hit the skin, those hooks would go into the skin and actually rip the skin off. So it's a very brutal punishment. The other thing about the scourging is that the wounds are located throughout the body. So they're on the back and on the front, and they're throughout the pelvic area. There was no modesty cloth like we're used to seeing in the movies, because being naked was a part of the humiliation associated with the torture. So these scourge marks are all over the body from the shoulders to the feet. And again, this is a fulfillment of a prophecy that says, not finding it, but they have, let's see, there's a prophecy that says that they have struck me from my head to the soles of my feet. I'll find it. So the other thing that the shroud shows us, I don't think I have a picture of it, is that there were two scourgers. So there was one on either side. And the reason why they know this is because they can actually see the angle of the scourge marks and know that there were two scourgers of different height. One was taller than the other. And they probably alternated. So Jesus was attached to a scourging post, similar to this from the Passion of the Christ. And the scourgers alternated, scourging one and then the other, and until they probably were exhausted. And in the Jewish law, the whipping, because Paul talks a lot about, I've been whipped, the 39 lashes. He talks about that in his letters. And the Jewish law prohibited more than 40 lashes. So the Jewish law always stopped at 39 lashes. And that's a single lash, not like with a three-pronged instrument like the Romans used. But the Romans didn't have that. The Romans scourged somebody up until they were almost dead. And that is what historians think happened to Jesus, is that he was scourged so brutally that by the time the scourging was completed, he was in hypovolemic shock from the loss of body fluid, from the blood, and then also from the repeated hitting around his chest area. So his area around his heart would have started to fill up with the pericardium. That area would start to fill up with the fluid and put pressure on his heart. So by the time the scourging was over, he would already have been very close to death. So in this slide, you can see that this prophecy from Isaiah said that in Isaiah 53, it said, by his stripes we are healed. And this is a pretty vivid indication of that. I have some things from doctors that talk about the scourging, like medically, and it's kind of sickening. It's very vivid. So I think I was very wrong, but the idea is that the skin would be completely destroyed by the scourging. So the next thing that the scriptures tell us is that after the scourging, Jesus was turned over to the Roman soldiers. And the Roman soldiers put the Roman cloak on him, the scarlet cloak that the Roman soldiers wore, and they put a reed in his hand. And that they went out and got some thorns and brought it back and placed it on his head. And this, in the Gospel of John, it says, the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and put a purple robe on him. And I think you noticed in our exhibit, we have a cap of thorns. Looks very similar to that. And this is, I've seen a video clip of Father Dalton where he was asked, what is the most significant evidence to you that the man of the shroud is Jesus? And Father Dalton's answer was this cap of thorns. So for a variety of reasons. One is because we're so used to, in art, seeing Jesus with just like a circlet of thorns on his head, like like the Greek athletes would have gotten a laurel wreath. But the reality is there are 52 individual puncture wounds on his scalp and also on the nape of his neck, which are independent of the scourging. These are puncture wounds. And the scriptures tell us that not only did they force these thorns down on his head, but then they hit him in the head with a reed, so that they really made sure that these thorns penetrated all the way down to the bony plate. And if you've ever had a head injury, even just a small wound to your head bleeds a lot. So a lot of the blood that's on the shroud was in his hair. And then, of course, there's this famous blood flow from his on his forehead. So the scientists can even tell this is venous blood because the venous blood is not coming out under pressure. The blood that's in his hair, it's kind of more spurted out because that was arterial blood that was under pressure. But the venous blood is more slow moving, and that's why this one on his forehead is the slow glob of blood. So the crown of thorns is significant because it most likely was from this plant, the Gundelia terniforti, and this is a plant that blooms in the spring in the area in the Middle East, and it has these large thorns on it, the 1.5 to 2 inch long thorns, and the most amount of pollen that was found on the shroud was from this plant. 27% of the pollen grains that are on the shroud are from this plant, and they're in the shoulder and head area. So we talked about the pollen in the last session, so if you weren't here, it's on the video from the last session. So the other thing, I'm going to see how much time I have. Not that much, okay, because I like to talk about the theological significance of the crown of thorns. So for Protestants aren't used to seeing a cross with the body on it. Usually in the Protestant world, you just see the cross. In the Catholic world, you see the cross with the corpus on it, and then with the crown of thorns. And so I grew up in a Catholic home. I grew up seeing a corpus on a cross with a crown of thorns my whole life, and never even gave two thoughts to it. Like, oh yeah, well that's Jesus, he has a crown of thorns on his head. But as I started learning more, I started to understand that this crown of thorns is extremely significant. For one thing, Jesus is the only person in recorded history to ever have been crowned with thorns. So we have the scriptures telling us that Jesus was crowned with thorns and the man of the shroud was crowned with thorns. So that's a link that exists with nobody else in history. But then the theological significance of Jesus wearing a crown of thorns takes on a lot of weight, because if you go back to Genesis, with the fall, when Adam and Eve sinned, and the punishment for that sin was that from now on, we would have to work to make our living, to get food from the ground. And the results of that sin was thorns and thistles. And so Jesus is taking the result of that sin, these thorns and thistles, and wearing them on his head and taking them with him to the cross. So there's a lot of theological significance to that. So we shouldn't take it for granted that oh, of course Jesus had a crown of thorns. So the purpose of the soldiers was to mock Jesus, that he was a king. And Jesus said to them, you don't understand my kingdom. My kingdom is not of this world. And so it's he wore the crown that was a shape of a cap, because the high priest wore a cap whenever he was doing service on behalf of the people. So the high priest they called it a crown, but it was shaped like a cap. And so that is the shape of what Jesus is wearing as he's taking our sins and making the perfect offering. There's more theological significance, but that's a good taste of it for right now. So,
Question.
Yes.
At what point did they remove the crown? He wasn't in the tomb with the crown. So
There was no crown in the tomb. Just the pollen was left
So
on
when he
the...
got off the cross, they took it off him then? and
Apparently,
then,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So the next thing we know that happened, according to the scriptures, is that he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. So this is important because we're so used to seeing Jesus carrying the full cross, the upright portion and the crossbeam. But the reality is that the upright portion of the cross stayed in place at the place of execution, and the condemned people only carried the crossbeam. The crossbeam alone weighed between 75 and 125 pounds. So he was already in a very weakened condition, and he wouldn't have been able to carry the full cross. So the shroud shows us that he carried the cross on his right shoulder blade, which has this excoriation here. And then on his left shoulder blade, there's another excoriation from where the crossbeam kind of went across his back as he carried it. And I just read this in the past month that before Pope John Paul II was Pope, he was interviewing Padre Pio, and Padre Pio had the stigmata. And he was asking him, what is the most painful part of the stigmata? And Padre Pio said it was the shoulder wound. And I had never known that before. And he said people don't think about that, but he said that's the one that he feels constantly, is the weight of that cross on his shoulders. So, I mean, the symbolism of that is powerful, that Jesus took the weight of the sins of all the world on his shoulders and carried them when he carried the weight of the cross. So this is showing what you see on the shroud, that there is this excoriation on it's the right shoulder because, it's a mirror image. And then on the left shoulder blade where it rubbed. And this is probably how Jesus was led out to the cross in a chain gang, because we know he was crucified with two other people, one on his right and one on his left. They were most likely tied together, and they most likely were tied with their hands to the wood of the cross. So they would have had no way to break a fall if they were to stumble and to trip and fall. So this is the next thing we see on the shroud, is that these wounds in the knees are they're bruised and they're cut. And I find this very interesting because the Gospels don't tell us that Jesus fell on the way to the cross. But in the Catholic tradition, we have the Stations of the Cross, and in the Stations of the Cross, he falls 3 times. But it's nowhere in the scriptures, but that's a tradition that has been passed down and maintained in the Stations of the Cross. We talked about this last time, that when they did the sticky tape samples, and that torque applicator that's in the exhibit is what they used for the sticky tape samples. When they took sticky tape samples from the area of the knees and the feet, they found this dust and dirt. And when they matched that dust and dirt, it matched the travertine aragonite limestone that makes up the grottos or the tombs that are outside the walls of Jerusalem. And that dust is like a fingerprint. So it exactly matches the dust and dirt of the area of Jerusalem. And so it was taken from the area of the knees and then also from the tip of the nose. And the reason for that is because with his arms outstretched and tied to the wood of the cross, he would have not had any way to break his fall. So if he fell to his knees and then fell to his chest, his face would fall in the dirt. And that's why there was the dirt at the tip of the nose. The other thing about that is that full weight of that 75 to 125 pound crossbeam on his back would have come crushing down on him too, at any time he would have fallen. And the scriptures tell us that Simon of Cyrene had to come and help Jesus to carry the cross because he was too weak. And I really like this little detail. It says in Luke, they seized Simon of Cyrene and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. So Luke puts in that little detail that Jesus walked ahead and Luke followed behind, which is a picture of discipleship, of everyone picking up their cross and following Jesus. Okay, so in the 10th station of the cross, we see that Jesus is stripped of his garments. And I never really thought much about the significance of this until I heard Father Dalton talk about that everything Jesus is doing in the Passion is making a way for us to get back to Eden. And the significance of that is because in Eden, that's where we could commune with God. We were in the very presence of God in the garden, and he walked with us and talked with us, and we could be with him face to face. And the whole purpose of this passion and death and resurrection is to take us back to that place where we could be in communion with God. And so this idea of Jesus is stripped of his garments. So at the foot of the cross, he's stripped of his garments because in Eden, we're naked without shame. We're pure before God. And that's what Jesus is doing for us. He's taking us back to that time. So the next thing the scriptures tell us is, and they don't tell us very much, it says, In Luke it says, when they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Really, they tell us about nothing about the crucifixion, but the Shroud tells us a lot about the crucifixion. So in the first session, we talked about Pierre Barbet, who was a French scientist who actually crucified cadavers so that he could understand the mechanism for crucifixion, because after it was outlawed in the 4th century by Constantine, nobody was crucified anymore. So people didn't really know the process for crucifixion. And so we're used to seeing the medieval art where Jesus is crucified through the palms of his hands. But the Shroud shows that the wounds, we only have one wound for the arms, is actually in the wrist area. And this is what Pierre Barbet discovered, is that there's a space when you put your thumb and your pinky together, there's like a
Dimple.
yeah, there's a place here at the base of your hand where a nail could be driven through this area and it will exit right here, exactly at the place where the bloodstains are on the Shroud. And so the bones of the hand will open up enough to drive that nail through that space and then close back around the nail so that it can hold the body securely. A nail driven through the palm of the hand would not support the weight of the body. It would just rip right out. So this is, Pierre Barbet discovered this. He started doing his studies in the 1930s. They were published in the 50s that proved that this blood that's shown on the Shroud is accurate for what would take place for crucifixion. The other thing you see is that there's a split in the blood flows here. And the reason for that, we'll talk about, it's because of the positioning on the cross in order to be able to breathe. But we'll come back to that. Let's see. I wanted to mention one of the things the skeptics say about the Shroud is that, well, the scriptures say that Jesus was nailed through the palm. And we know that's not exactly true. Like the place where they say it is when Jesus came, this was two weeks ago or 3 weeks ago when Jesus appeared before the followers, and Thomas said, I won't believe unless I probe the wounds in his hands and his feet. But this word for hand doesn't mean the palm of the hand. It can be anywhere from the hand all the way up to the forearm. So the Hebrew word for hand includes the wrist area. The other place we see it is also in Isaiah 53, where it says, I have carved you on the palms of my hands. So we see that prophecy fulfilled in Jesus' crucifixion, but it's not in the center of the palm, but in this place where the exit wound could be in the wrist. So that's showing you where that space is for the wounds. And then this is how the victim was crucified. Laid down on the crossbeam, there was a pre-existing hole for the nail. And so one hand was put down, the nail was put through, and then the other arm stretched out to wherever the other hole was. So if the arm didn't reach, they would dislocate the shoulder to stretch the arm to the other pre-existing hole. And then take the body and lift it up and put it on the upright portion of the cross. And we're used to seeing Jesus up really high, like 6 feet up off the ground, but the reality is he only had to be up a foot or 18 inches off the ground, just enough so his feet didn't touch the ground, so that his body would be supported by his hands. Then the Shroud shows us the wounds also in the feet, and there are crucifixion marks in both feet, but it's not known whether one nail was used or 2 nails were used for the feet. And there have only been 2 crucifixion victims found where their nails were still in the feet. So one was found back in the 1960s, and then the most recent one was found, I think it was either 2021 or 2022. I mean, just found. And so scientists are trying to reconstruct how the feet were actually nailed to the cross based on these 2 skulls or skeletons that were found. And the reason why there's no bones with nails in them is because the nails were reused. So once the victim died, they would take the nails out and throw the body into a pit, and then the nails would be reused on the next victim. So these 2 that were found, it looks like maybe they hit a knot hole in the wood and it caused the nail to bend, and so then the nail couldn't be removed from the foot. So there have been 2 found, and they're trying to figure out, well, was he nailed through both feet together, or were the feet nailed independently? And another theory is that the feet were actually nailed kind of like straddling the wood of the cross with knees bent out to the side. So, not known what the truth is on that yet. The one thing that is known is that the knees were bent. And the reason we know the knees are bent is because they're bent in the shroud. And then also because the mechanism for death on the cross was death by asphyxiation. And so the idea of crucifixion was torture, and it was to be as prolonged as possible. So the victim would have had his feet nailed to the cross and the knees bent, because in the lower position he could passively inhale. But in order to exhale, he would have to straighten his legs and push down on that nail through his feet, or nails, and then rotate through those wrists to push himself up so that he could actively exhale. And then he would collapse back down and then passively inhale. So a person could live on the cross for 2 or 3 days as long as they had enough strength to push themselves up and down against the wood in order to breathe. So Jesus was nailed to the cross somewhere between 9 a.m. and noon. So he'd already been up all night. He'd already had all of these things happen to him that we've been talking about. And the scriptures tell us that he died at around 3 o'clock. So he was on the cross either 3 to 6 hours. It says in the Gospel of John, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. And in the Gospel of Matthew, it says, with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. And I point that out with a loud cry because what I just described to you, this death by asphyxiation, means that you don't have any air. And so in order to cry out, you have to have air going past your vocal cords. So Jesus didn't die of asphyxiation. And I think this is important because Jesus willingly died. He gave up his spirit. He wasn't a victim of just the torture that he had experienced. He willingly gave up his life. And what scientists think happened is that there was this buildup of the fluid around his heart, and it put increasing pressure on his heart until he had a traumatic event in his heart, and it would have caused a rupture in the cell wall, and he would have died suddenly. And in essence, he died from a broken heart. So the next thing we see is the wound in the side. If anybody asks me what my favorite thing to talk about the shroud, this is what I would answer: the wound in the side. I think this is very profound and has a lot of theological significance. And also because John, in his gospel, he wanted us to pay a lot of attention to it. He said, this is from John's gospel, one of the soldiers thrust a lance into his side, and immediately a flow of blood and water came forth. So he tells us the facts, and then he says, an eyewitness has testified to this. So John is talking about himself because he was at the foot of the cross, and he wants us to know that blood and water came out. But he doesn't stop there. He says, his testimony is true. So John's talking about himself. I want you to know my testimony is true. And then he ends with this. He knows that what he says is true, so that you may also believe. So this is very important for John, that blood and water flowed out. And he's telling us this so we can believe. And this is where I think the miracle of the shroud is so profound, because it wasn't until the shroud was photographed in 1978 using ultraviolet fluorescent photography that the separation of the blood and water could be seen. So this confirms that what John said in his gospel, that blood and water flowed out, is proven using modern technology. So what I'm explaining is that when Jesus died, this wound from the spear was a post-mortem wound. So the reason why the soldier pierced Jesus in the side was to make sure he was really dead, because he had only been on the cross for a relatively short amount of time, and victims could stay on the cross for 2 or 3 days. And Pilate, remember, expressed surprise. What? He's already dead? And the scriptures tell us they went to the other 2 people on the cross and broke their legs. And the reason why they broke their legs is because once their legs were broken, they could no longer push themselves up to exhale the air. So they would break their legs, and then they would die immediately because they had no way to exhale. But that didn't happen to Jesus because none of his bones could be broken. So because of all of this trauma that he had experienced, all of this fluid had built up around his heart. And when he died, the heart stopped beating, and so the blood and the serum, the clear liquid serum, separated. And so the heavy red corpuscles went to the bottom, and the light, clear serum floated to the top. So when he was pierced in the side, there truly looked like blood and water flowed out, and that's what John saw. And this is where the church talks about the sacraments. So the sacrament of baptism is reflected in the water, and then the sacrament of the Eucharist is the blood flowing forth from Jesus' side. To me, this is really significant related to the shroud, because on the shroud you can see that there is some separation. You can see some of it with the naked eye. Like right here, you can see that there's separation in the blood, but under the UV light, I don't know if I have a better picture of it. I think it's in your books.
You did it one time.
I did it one time. I had a better picture where you can actually see that under the UV light, you can see the halo serum, the halo from the serum of that clear fluid. And that wasn't known until 1978. And I just think that's so remarkable, because what else is hidden in the shroud?
Yeah.
That until we have better technology that can study it and understand it, we don't know what's hidden in there. So, the theological significance of this piercing of the side, this is one of my favorite topics, but we're not going to have a lot of time to go over it. But in the book of Hebrews, the Hebrews writer says that through the veil of his flesh, Jesus passed through the veil and offered the perfect sacrifice on behalf of all people for all time. All 3 of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, say that at the moment Jesus died, the veil in the temple was torn in 2, and it was torn in 2 from top to bottom. So this is a depiction of that veil. So the temple was set up so that there was an outer courtyard, and then there was the inner courtyard, which was the holy place. And then what separated the holy place from the most holy place was the veil. And I always thought, the veil, oh, that's like the chapel veil I used to wear when I went to Mass. Like a thin, frilly kind of thing that could easily be torn. But the reality is that it was this huge curtain, more like a tapestry, that was so big and so heavy it took 300 priests to move it. And the only person who went behind that veil to go into the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, was the high priest. And the high priest could only go behind that veil one time a year, and that was on the Day of Atonement. So we already talked about the great pilgrimage feast of Passover. Another great pilgrimage feast for the Jewish people was the Day of Atonement. And today they still celebrate it, Yom Kippur. And that was the day when the high priest had a lot of duties that day, one of which was they would bring the goats to him, and he would choose one that would be spared. And the other one, he would place his hands on the head of that goat, and he would put all the sins of the people on the head of that goat, which would remind you of a crown of thorns. Mm-hmm. And then he would send that goat off, carrying the sins of the people into the wilderness. So that was the scapegoat. So that was one of the things that happened on the Day of Atonement. The other thing that happened on the Day of Atonement is that the high priest would dress in a pure linen garment, and he would go behind the veil, and he would sprinkle the blood of the perfect sacrifice on the altar in atonement for the sins of all the people. And that would only happen one day a year. Nobody else would ever go into the most holy place, ever, except for that time. And so what the scriptures tell us is that the moment Jesus died, that veil that separated the people from the presence of God It was torn in two from top to bottom. So Jesus was the perfect atoning sacrifice, and he was dressed like the high priest. He was wearing this clean, which means ritually pure. That means that it had no wool or cotton in the fabric. It was pure linen. He's dressed in that as he goes behind the veil and opens up the most holy place for all people for all time. And that's what we see at the moment Jesus dies, and then the spear wound in the side. All right, I lost where I was.
Did the Jewish people ever try to figure out why the veil was ripped?
It's a historical fact that it happened. I mean, other people reported that.
But did they ever, because Jesus said that he would tear down the temple.
Right, and rebuild it.
And rebuild it, so I would think that.
So in 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple. The temple was completely destroyed in fulfillment of what Jesus said. You know, the Stations of the Cross say that when Jesus was on his way to the cross and the women of Jerusalem came out and were weeping, and he said, "Don't weep for me, weep for yourselves and weep for your children because of what's coming." And so the whole temple was completely destroyed. Not one stone was left on top of another one of this great, magnificent architecture that was there. So since that time, the Jewish people, they don't have a sacrificial system anymore. They don't offer sacrifices because they don't have a temple. So I don't know if that answers your question, but they had to change their system because they didn't have a way to offer sacrifices anymore.
I guess I was just wondering that if it took 300 priests to move that veil,
Yeah.
then all of a sudden it's ripped. It's like, okay, how did it get ripped?
Yeah.
Wouldn't they have investigated that?
Yeah. Well, the other thing about the architecture of the temple, which I think this is really fascinating, is that, you know, there were all these lambs that were being sacrificed. 100 to 200,000 lambs were being sacrificed. That's a lot of blood. And so the way the temple was structured was that there was a drain on the right side of the temple where all of that blood and water flowed out of the right side of the temple, which is exactly what we see happening with Jesus. And we also see, again, going back to Eden, where was Eve? Where did Eve come from? She came from the side of Adam. So it's the image of the birth of the church, is that the people of God are birthed from the side of Jesus as he is pierced in the side on the cross. Okay, I mentioned that the legs were not broken, and we know that they were not broken because Jesus is in rigor mortis when he's wrapped in the shroud. And so this position is not because there's a pillow under his head or a pillow under his knees. It's because when he died, under a great deal of stress and trauma, he went into rigor mortis quickly because the rigor happens faster for somebody under stress. And so his legs are clearly not broken. It's shown in the shroud. We have already talked about that he was not, his body was not washed, because I imagine that'll be a question that you get, that his body was not washed. So, and I want to say that in the exhibit there is that little plaque about the things on the eyes. And so the shroud does show that there are small things, discs on the eyes. And some people theorize that it's a lepton, which was a unit of coin that was minted under Pontius Pilate, but that is not conclusive. There is something on the eyes, and the reason for that is to keep the eyes closed so that they remain closed. But what that is not conclusive. So I just wanted to point that out because I think it's a little confusing in the exhibit, because Genevieve was tying the shroud exhibit to the rest of the museum exhibits, and she said that in typical Jewish burial custom, the face was covered with a face cloth, and that coins were sometimes put on the eyes. But in the case of Jesus, the face cloth was removed, and we don't know if they were coins. It was something small placed over his eyes. So you'll probably get a question about that, I would imagine. So the rigor mortis lasts between, it begins within a few hours of death, and then it relaxes between 36 and 40 hours. So that's the amount of time that Jesus was wrapped in the linen. And I thought it was so interesting, the readings this week for Mass were from Peter, and he gave his sermon in Acts of the Apostles, and he was quoting David, saying, "My beloved will know no decay." And so we see that prophecy from David fulfilled in the shroud, because there's no signs of decay on the shroud. There's no putrefaction. There's no ammonia gas release from the corpse starting to decay. So we see that being fulfilled in Jesus. And then we also see that Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea took possession of the body and wrapped it in a fine linen. We talked last time about the linen being very fine, that this was something that was on the order of silver and gold, because it was so finely wrought. It wasn't just a 1/1 weave, it was a 3/1 herringbone weave. It had a selvage on both sides, which made it also, it had a finished end on both sides. And it was a pure linen garment. So it was an expensive thing, befitting a rich man like Joseph of Arimathea. So we see Jesus being wrapped in this fine linen, like a priest wearing his linen garment, and then he's placed in this new tomb that had never been used before. He was buried like a king. So we see those two offices of Jesus in this burial, priest and king. Okay. And then we have the resurrection. And I love that quote that Mary Jane shared with us, that it would take all of the power that currently exists in the world to make an image like this. So that's in that Newsmax article. Maybe we need to put a sign like that. So, nobody knows how the image was made. It's an ongoing mystery, as the Sturp team said. So there are people who are actively studying this right now about what could possibly have caused this. And Father Spitzer, if you guys are familiar with him, he gives a lecture where he talks about 12,000 excimer lasers couldn't create this image with the level of detail and precision that it exists. So right now, the mechanism for how this image was formed it's unknown. It's a mystery. So that's the whole objective of the Sturp team, was to understand how this image was formed. And they left after 5 days and 120 hours of study, and then 3 years of research afterwards, with their conclusion being that it's not the product of an artist, and how it was formed remains a mystery for now. So, yes.
Father Spitzer also mentioned that if this was some kind of a burst of ultraviolet light emanating from the body, that it would have had to been, forget what part of a billionth of a second.
I think it's a 1/12.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Billion
Yeah.
of a second. That otherwise everything would have disintegrated.
It would have vaporized Jerusalem. Yeah.
Yeah. That was
Yeah.
really,
I have a lecture that Father Spitzer gave in in February in Orange County that I'll send to you guys. It's being worked on right now, but he talks about that. And, he's so smart, and he has all that science.
He's got a couple of things on YouTube. One's an hour, one's a half an hour, and if you go to the Maja Center, that's where a lot of his, and he's very scientific.
Yes.
He's very scientific. He's a priest. He's very scientific. So, when he talks about things, he talks about it from both the perspective of faith, but also of reason and science.
Okay, that was a lot to cover. One of the questions I imagine that you'll get is, what does the church say about the shroud? And it's, the church doesn't take a position on the shroud. So the shroud belongs to the current pope, so it's owned by Pope Francis. But the church doesn't say whether it's the authentic burial Christ of Jesus or not. They let people decide for themselves. So I imagine that's a question that will come up.
And when you say the church, they're referring to the Catholic?
To the Catholic Church, yeah.
What about the other denominations?
I don't think a lot of other denominations even know the shroud exists. It's sort of been considered a Catholic thing, so.
You mentioned last time that it's considered icon, not a relic.
Yes, so the church calls it, the Catholic Church calls it an
Good
icon.
distinction.
Yeah,
What-
so it's an image.
Yeah,
It's an
It's
image.
just a picture,
Mhm. So,
as opposed to a relic.
It's a bit of science.
Yeah.
That's what they say. It's real.
yeah. But I do think that there's the element of faith, and I don't think we'll ever have definitive proof, because faith is a gift, and it's a gift that we have to accept. And so the shroud leads us there. It takes us almost all the way there, but the last step is the step of faith that each person has to take individually. So this is what Pope John Paul said. Our faith is not based on wonders and signs, but the Word of God. For the believer, the shroud is a mirror of the gospel, an image of God's love. And I think it was Pope Benedict who said it's a gospel written in blood. And I
Sorry,
think
what was it?
a gospel written in blood. I just want to say thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
I mean,
Thank you.
oh, well, this is like such a privilege for me to get to talk about this with you guys, and you guys all have, your hearts are just so open, and you want to know this and you want to share it, and it's just a blessing to be with all of you. So thank you. And I just feel so blessed that this is happening. I mean, it's been quite a journey, so it's really a gift to the city that this is happening. I want to call you Murphy, but I know it's not.
That's all right. We in the way the exhibit came about, we heard the story in the beginning, but how did you get involved?
Okay, well, it's on the first slide, the panel where it talks about the journey of the shroud.
Okay.
But, so not all of you heard that Lori was the one who gave Father Jared the idea in the first place about having a shroud exhibit here at the funeral museum. And I knew Father Jared because we were both taking the Shroud Studies course, which you have the brochure in your book for the Shroud Studies course, that you can learn more than you ever thought there was to know about the shroud through. And Father Dalton is the teacher of the pastoral and biblical implications of the shroud. And so Father Jared and I were taking the class for the first time. It was the first time it was offered in English. And so Father Jared and I were the only people in the world taking the class in English. And so Father Dalton recognized that we both lived in Houston, and he said, you two need to talk. So Father Jared and I met for coffee and became friends, and then he came here with Lori, and he called me on his way home from his visit here. He was so excited. He was like, you just can't believe this place. You've got to come see it. I mean, for those of you who know Father Jared, he's young, he's super excited, and he's just such a treat. And I'm like, okay. So he's like, okay, tomorrow, can you come and meet with Genevieve? And I'm like, sure. So I came up here, and Father Jared and I met with Genevieve and said, what do you think about having the shroud exhibit here? And she didn't really know. She had heard of the shroud, but she didn't really know what it was. And after we talked to her, she said, yes, we definitely need to have that here. Mm-hmm. And I think that might have been, you know when it was, Lori. When was it?
November 30th is the day that we came here.
2018.
Yeah, because I was trying to schedule the group on the day that Docent was available to give us a tour. And it had to be on Friday, but it had to be in November because of All Souls.
Oh.
And so I remember calling it a number of times. It's like, right at the last day, right?
So that's when it all started. So November 30th, I'll have to try to remember that, 2018. So it's been a long time.
That's even before they did the seeds or anything else. Did they know they're going to do a
Exactly.
shroud reproduction or not?
I had no idea. I had no idea that was even happening until they told us we were getting it.
Oh, they were just going to have information about the shroud here, not
We were going to
necessarily
have a
relic.
replica, but it was going to be on cotton. It was going to be
That's-
just
okay, yeah.
It was going to still come from the Archdiocese of Turin, but it wasn't going to be on linen.
Yeah,
Like the linen one is so
Yeah.
beautiful.
okay.
Yeah. So, yes,
So
Vicki?
tell us a little bit about what's going to happen in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't want to keep, if anybody wants to go, please feel free to go, because I know it's late and everything.
We wanna.
You want to know? Okay, so, all right, I'm so grateful to Genevieve because, so that was in 2018 that happened. So 2019, we had heard that there was going to be this exhibit at the Museum of the Bible. And Barry Schwartz is the one who told me, he's like, you need to learn more about this. And so I got online, I see that they're going to have this exhibit in Washington, D.C., and I called Genevieve and I said, we need to go. So we got our tickets like 2 weeks before, and we go. And we're like kind of going around like little mice because we're like, I especially was like, I don't belong here. Like, these were the Shroud people in the world, like really famous people, knowledgeable people. And I'm like, Genevieve, can I say I'm a part of the museum? Like, I didn't even know how to represent myself. And Genevieve was like, oh yeah, say whatever you want. So we got connected with all these people, just asking all these questions about what's your exhibit and how do I get to know you people? And so one of the main people behind that exhibit was a woman named Myra Adams. And Myra has a 501c3 called Sign from God. And it's her own thing that she's kind of done on her own. And she was connected with the Museum of the Bible people already. And so she was the one who was like, you really should have the Shroud here. It's the Museum of the Bible. So what's more connected to the Bible than the Shroud? So they agreed to do a temporary exhibit. And it was supposed to open in 2020, but because of COVID, it didn't open. So it didn't actually open until 2022. And so that gave us a lot of time to get connected with all these people. So I called up Myra and I said, I feel like I need to know you, and I'm interested in the Shroud. So we just became friends, and I've gotten to know all these people because of this project. And so last July, Myra and Cheryl White, who runs the exhibit, which is in Shreveport, and then Lisa Rowan, who works at the Museum of the Bible, the four of us decided that we should
University of Maryland.
Oh, it's Shreveport. Do you know Lisa?
Yeah, I know Lisa.
Oh, okay. So we decided to go to the Napa Institute. Have you ever heard of the Napa Institute? I mean, it's in Napa, so it didn't sound all bad. So it's part of the Magis Institute. Father Spitzer is one of the sponsors of the Napa Institute. So we all decided that we would go there and see what there was to see. And so when we got there, the four of us all met in person, and we decided to form the National Shroud of Turin exhibit team. So this was last July, so less than a year ago. So by December, we had a website for this, and Myra, she gets things done. She had some connections at the Catholic Information Center, which is in downtown Washington, D.C. And she went to talk to them about, did they want to have a Shroud exhibit? Because the Museum of the Bible had this replica, just like ours, in storage, not being seen, because their exhibit was a 6-month exhibit. Then they closed it down, and then they disassembled it. And their replica is hanging on a wall and nobody can see it. So Myra convinced them to loan the replica to the Catholic Information Center. And the Catholic Information Center has a chapel. It's the closest chapel to the White House in all of DC. And they say daily mass there. It's run by Opus Dei. Opus Dei priests are there. And so they providentially had a wall that was 14.5 feet long. And so Myra said, can we display the Shroud replica there? And so she did all the gymnastics to get the Museum of the Bible to agree to it. So it was installed March 8th. And it was announced at the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast, which was on March 14th. And then we had the grand opening on March 28th. And it was widely covered by the press. So if you look on National Catholic Register, it was the number one article for the week of Easter. This year. Yeah. So, and Amy Coney Barrett was there in the front row with her family. And so, I mean, it got a lot of attention. So this is also a temporary exhibit, and it's just a replica right now. It's the replica, and then it's the same brochure that you guys have.
That's it?
That's it. That's the entire exhibit, because that's all we had the space for. So we're praying about putting it in a permanent space in Washington, D.C., because it belongs there.
Mhm.
And people need to hear about it, and our legislators need to know about it.
Mhm.
So,
President Biden doesn't know about it.
yeah.
It's okay, and Lisa, she's a University of Delaware person. She should have that Delaware tie.
Yeah, that's right. Well, she's got a lot of ties, let me tell you.
Yeah, she
So,
does.
Put
So-
a nice big freezer there.
So it's one of the 7 replicas?
Yes. So the one that's not on display in Washington, D.C., is one of the 7 replicas. Yeah.
What was the one that was in Shreveport? And the one that was in Louisiana?
You mean the exhibit that's there?
Yeah.
Okay, so that is known as the Aurareo Collection, O-R-A-R-E-O. And Richard Aurareo is a private individual, and he has the 3rd largest collection of Shroud memorabilia in the world. And so that collection it's not on display right now, but it's at the Cathedral of St. John Berksman in Shreveport, Louisiana. And Cheryl White is the curator of that. And Cheryl will be here on Thursday. Myra will be here Wednesday and Thursday. So they're coming to support this whole effort. But that exhibit, they have a lot of the things like the ostensions. So over the centuries when the Shroud was put on display, those are called ostensions. And so she has like these engravings, they're like silver engravings that are artworks that go back to the 1500s. She has the one from when Charles Borromeo came and venerated the Shroud in whatever year that was, 1578. She has the original engraving of that. So that collection, it's priceless. And it's in Shreveport.
And this reproduction you said was originally going to go to Moscow? And
Yeah.
then how did we get our hands on it as opposed to Montevideo, Chile, or whatever?
Yeah, well, I think it's because of Father Dalton.
Okay.
So what happened was I had written a letter. What?
I think it was your letter.
Well, I had written a letter that Cardinal DiNardo signed in January or February of 2019 from Cardinal DiNardo to the Archbishop of Turin.
Oh,
And so Cardinal DiNardo signed it, which is a great vote of confidence for this museum, that he said this is a worthy place to have this. And so that was in January, early 2019. I don't remember the exact timing. So we didn't hear. I mean, for years, literally for years. And I would send emails from time to time, like to the people I knew, like, what's going on with this letter that the Cardinal wrote? But what was going on behind the scenes was that the Archbishop was being replaced. So there was a new Archbishop coming in, and I think they wanted to have it be under the new Archbishop that these things were happening, and for whatever reason, there was a really long delay. And so I moved to California, and I kind of was like, okay, well, it's not going to happen. We hadn't heard anything, and Genevieve and I would talk from time to time, and I would say, well, if you want to have an exhibit, we can just buy something off of eBay. Like, there's plenty of Shroud replicas out there. And she was like, no, we're not getting anything off of eBay. We're not having it in this museum unless it's a certified copy. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to do one last ditch effort. So I sent a text to Father Dalton on a Friday night, and I said, okay, I'm about to give up on this. Can you help me out here? And it was Sunday morning, and it was one of the Sundays of Lent before Easter of 2022. And the first thing I got on that Sunday morning was an email from Enrico Siminato, who's the caretaker of the Shroud. And it was kind of like a mea culpa, like, oh, we forgot it was the Cardinal who requested this. So he said, not only are we gifting you the Shroud replica, because it normally costs like $1,200 to get one on cotton. He said, we are gifting you one of these very, very special ones that because of your patience. So I hadn't been patient, but he didn't know that. So that's how it came about.
wow.
So you'll hear this story again, because we're going to tell this story on Wednesday. Because it is very providential how it's all come together.
And why was it gonna go to Moscow?
They have a Shroud Center.
Really?
Yeah. And there's one in Poland. That's where one of them
I
is.
could see Poland.
Yeah.
I see Poland because of Thurman's Poitiers.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, even Father Dalton has been to Russia and Moscow and all over the Philippines.
Yeah, speaking.
You know,
Mhm.
lots of different.
So 2 bits of update on Father Dalton,
Uh-huh.
because you all know and love Father Dalton. He's going to be at the Sikh conference, which is Focus Ministry, in January. I just got confirmation about that. And he's going to be at the Eucharistic Congress in July.
Where are those?
The Sikh conference is in St. Louis, and then the Eucharistic Congress is in Indianapolis. And so we're gonna have a whole exhibit, I think, I'm praying, in Indianapolis for the
Would you email us
Eucharistic Congress.
that information?
Sure, yeah. And then we're going to World Youth Day, right? I've told you all that? No? So Cheryl White and Father Dalton and I are presenting at World Youth Day. We're doing a morning catechesis session for the pilgrims. So that's coming up.
And where's that?
In Lisbon, in
Oh,
Portugal.
Lisbon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you need one of us to go there? Just
Yeah.
curious.
Oh, we're back.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things in the works. It's like the interest in the Shroud is just mushrooming. It's just going all over the world. People are interested in the Shroud. And you guys are at ground zero.
Awesome, yeah.
Yeah. So,
Thank you, and thank
Thank
you
you.
for all of what you have done to bring it.
Yeah.
it's been my privilege.
Especially